and then Alex will speak to us.
An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to vindicate himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and took off, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while travelling, came upon him, and when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, treating them with oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
Morning. So this is the third of 3 sermons about, four sermons actually, about good apocalypses. So we're very used to the idea that apocalypses are always bad, that they mean the end of the world. And this set of sermons is really about the ideas that apocalypses can be something much more hopeful than that. They can be moments when the best comes out of us, when we pull together and when something new gets born. And the key to this ability to turn an apocalypse or a moment of shock or crisis into something beautiful and renewed is our ability to become a larger us rather than a them and us. And that's what the organisation that I run, which is called Larger Us, works on. And so last week we were talking about how that starts with us in our own hearts and minds, at the I level, if you like. And this week we're going to talk about the we level. So this is all about our relationships and our communities. And in particular, 2 themes. The first is connection, and the second is bridging. So let me start with connection. Have you ever noticed, if you like watching post-apocalyptic movies, which is something I always enjoy doing, how they're very keen on sort of rugged individuals? Think of Will Smith in I Am Legend. It's sort of just one guy on his own with a dog and an assault rifle. At most, maybe you have a little kind of roving survival band of 2 or 3 people, like Cillian Murphy in 28 Days Later, or Pedro Pascal in The Last of Us. It's all a bit lonely and disconnected. And of course, as we touched on in week 1, that is the opposite of what really happens in the aftermath of big shocks and disasters. Actually, people really pull together. You see amazing solidarity and selflessness in those moments. It's the tend and befriend response in action. And that's why my favourite kind of post-apocalyptic series is Station 11. If you've ever seen that one, it's so different from all the other ones because it's all about community. There's this travelling theatre troupe called the Travelling Symphony. And it's this beautiful, this sort of depiction of how community can still flourish when things are really difficult. And I wonder if some of you, like me, experienced some of that in the pandemic, where even amidst all the loneliness of the kind of enforced lockdowns, it was amazing how people showed up for each other, especially in those COVID mutual aid groups. Did anyone encounter one of those in the pandemic? The way that kind of, streets or neighbourhoods or villages self-organised to look after each other when things were really difficult. But of course, the bigger picture at the moment is very often, as we all know, a story of disconnection rather than connection. I came across a sort of story about that really landed it for me when I was reading a magazine a couple of weeks ago. And it was talking about how this trend that they see in the restaurant trade is increasingly that reservations are for one person. If we go out to eat, we like to do it on our own and just have a bit of time to ourselves. There was a very sad little vignette in that article about how a local restaurant in the United States, which used to have this really thriving little bar area where people would get together, now they'd had to close the bar area to have a place for deliveries to be picked up by Deliveroo and Uber Eats, because increasingly, again, eating is something that we do on our own. It's even true of worship. I mean, you might have thought that going to church is something that by definition is a congregational experience. But my friend Claire, who used to work at Westminster Abbey, observes this fascinating trend that even though a lot of parish churches are struggling these days, cathedrals are absolutely thriving. You go on any Sunday to kind of Leeds Minster or Westminster Abbey or wherever it might be, there's loads of people there. And I said to Claire last time I saw her, why do you think that is? Why do people want to go to cathedrals? And she said, I think it's that people love the liturgy and the music, but they don't want to have the hassle of hanging out with people who they might find difficult and annoying or see the world differently and so on. And then, of course, there's the form of disconnection that we all really enjoy, which is scrolling on our phones. I read this article that really made me laugh a couple of weeks ago about someone saying, my friends say, do you want to go out? Do you want to meet up? And her answer is, no, not really. It's such a hassle schlepping across town to meet up when you could be having golden moments, lying back on your sofa and just peacefully scrolling. And it's true, and I succumb to it myself the whole time. But the truth is that we know that those golden moments don't really satisfy us or nourish us, that actually at a deeper level, we're all really looking for deeper connection and belonging in our lives. And the big kind of social trend here is the so-called epidemic of loneliness that we keep reading about. And there's so much of that. We know that when we feel lonely, it doesn't make us feel good. It's bad for our mental health. It's bad for our physical health. It's sometimes said that if we're chronically lonely, it's as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But the thing I really want to pick up on here is that chronic loneliness, when you have societies that don't kindle connection, that's dangerous politically as well. There's lots of evidence to show that when we feel lonely all the time, it reduces our capacity for empathy, for one thing. And then you get the kind of really extreme stuff about how, with some people, and of course this isn't true of everybody who's chronically lonely, but some people, it's the route into extremism or radicalization. You remember that attack that took place in Headingley a couple of weeks ago? I went on that guy's Facebook feed before it got taken down, just because I was trying to understand, how could this happen here, in this neighbourhood that we all know so well? And I knew exactly what I was going to find there, and predictably, it was a story of loneliness, someone who was really isolated. The same as how every time in the United States you see one of those terrible mass shooter events, it's always a lonely man who's experienced social rejection. And again, of course, if we feel lonely, there's nothing to say that we're going to go down that route. Of course, most of us don't. But everybody who does get drawn into that radicalization is almost without exception lonely. And as we touched on, I think, a couple of talks ago, loneliness is also something that's almost like a precondition for totalitarian governments. It's really dangerous when societies aren't properly connected together. So we need to reconnect, both for our own well-being and for the well-being of the communities and societies that we're part of. And I think a big part of where that comes from, which is why I love All Hallows so much, is cultures of welcome that invite people in and make us feel like we belong and we're valued in spite of all of our shortcomings and so on. There's no kind of purity tests here. Everybody is welcome just as they are. So that's the sort of connection part. And I think that churches and the small groups that are often part of churches, like kind of home groups or Bible study groups, are just amazing little kind of cells that can then multiply to become something much bigger. And as we'll talk about next week, are amazing building blocks for movements that can change the world. But the other half of what I want to talk about today, which I think is really relevant to this moment of kind of culture wars that we keep seeing and keep separating us, is how do we bridge divides? Because there's so many of them around at the moment. And I think it's worth taking a second to understand where all this division and culture war is coming from. Some of it definitely comes from fear and anxiety, all the stuff we were talking about last week. But there's also something about how our brains work that's relevant here as well. There's a cognitive bias that we all have, natural part of our makeup, called in-group bias, which is how whenever we see ourselves as part of a group, it is the most natural thing in the world to regard other members of that group more favourably and to give them preferential treatment. Now, this is not always bad. My daughter, who's 15, is an avid Swiftie. And last summer, somehow miraculously, we got tickets to the Eras tour. And the experience of being on a kind of metro train in Edinburgh, with her done up in her outfit, she refused to let me wear the t-shirt saying, "It's me, hi, I'm the dad, it's me." Lost opportunity. But watching her face, each stop on that subway line when the doors opened and even more Swifties got in, wearing the t-shirts and the sparkly skirts and 13 on their hands and everything. Watching her light up. Finally, she was with her people. Beautiful to watch. Really touching. That was an in-group moment for her. And no one was being excluded or othered. It was just a beautiful thing. But when in-group bias starts showing up in politics, that's when things get way more dangerous. That's the kind of fast track to the kind of tribalism and division that we keep seeing. And there's also a big sociological trend that kind of amplifies all of this, and it's the trend that sociologists call the big sort. This is the trend that you probably all experienced, where now more than ever before, we're really likely to grow up with, go to school with, befriend, study with, work with, date, marry people whose backgrounds and outlooks are similar to our own. We live in increasingly homogenous little kind of bubbles of the like-minded. It's why Brexit was such a shock to so many people. Most Remainers didn't know that many Leavers, and most Leavers didn't know that many Remainers. It's so easy when we're in our little echo bubbles to think that everyone sees the world just like we do. And of course, social media just amplifies that even more because it's so good at clustering us into little echo chambers of the like-minded. And what that means is when we do accidentally encounter someone who sees the world totally differently to how we do, it can be a bit of a shock. And it can kind of be a bit threatening. It can make us feel unsettled or angry. Now, the people who thrive on division, the kind of populists of the far right and Donald Trump and the Reform Party and all of that thing, they love this stuff. Because when we're sorted into our little kind of, competing echo chambers, rarely encountering each other, and when we do, shouting at each other, that's great for them. It creates a dynamic that's called mutual radicalization, where one group starts acting in a way that makes the other group feel threatened. Maybe they're expressing contempt or something like that. The second group starts showing it back to the first group, then we feel threatened, and it's this kind of ping-pong back and forth where nothing's happening except a steady increase of toxicity and rage. One of the things that really struck me in Trump's first term was when Steve Bannon, his chief advisor at the time, let it slip that they deliberately timed Trump's Muslim ban to maximize liberal outrage, to get the kind of progressive people out protesting, because he knew that that would be threatening to the people in Trump's base and fire them up, and that's just great for them. So what's the antidote? How do we avoid that kind of mutual radicalization and instead start to kind of bridge divides and come back together? Well, one thing we obsess about at Larger Us, we're totally evangelical about it, is the power of curious conversations across divides. I think I might have mentioned here before two of my personal heroes who practiced this and showed the incredible things that it could achieve, who are Daryl Davis and Dave Fleischer. Daryl Davis is that amazing African-American blues musician who in his spare time goes to KKK rallies. Not an obvious kind of pastime, but Daryl grew up and had this kind of amazing, he was a child of diplomats, so he lived all over the world, very cosmopolitan, very at ease with different cultures. And then he came back to live in the United States as a young teenager. And he went on a scout march in the little town where he lived and realized that people were throwing bottles. And his thought at the time was like, wow, they must really not like the scouts in this town. But then he realized the bottles were being thrown at him, the only black kid on the march. And he was astonished. I mean, I talked to Daryl, and he said it's the first time I ever experienced racism. And I didn't understand where it was coming from. And the other guy, Dave Fleischer, had a sort of somewhat comparable experience. Dave is an extraordinary activist, lives in LA, runs this thing called the Leadership Lab, which is part of the LA LGBTQ Rights Center. And back in 2008, when there was a statewide referendum on equal marriage in California, the LGBT community thought they were going to win, but they narrowly lost. And a lot of people were furious. But Dave, a bit like Daryl, after that march, was just puzzled. He's like, I don't get it. This was such an obviously common sense measure. Why do people feel so threatened? How can they dislike me when they don't even know me? And what both Daryl and Dave did with that was act with curiosity. In Daryl's case, he has sat down and had conversations with more than 200 white supremacists that have led to those people leaving organizations like the KKK. Daryl literally has a cupboard full of KKK robes that people have given him when they left the KKK. As for Dave Fleischer, Dave, after that statewide referendum in 2008, also responded with curiosity. He went around and started ringing doorbells in some of LA's most conservative districts. And he wasn't showing up kind of shaming people or shouting at them or, besieging them with arguments about why they were wrong, though he could have done those things. But he was listening first and then establishing some emotional common ground. And what both Daryl and Dave would say is, I don't change anybody's minds. I establish the emotional common ground, and then people change their own minds because they see the inconsistencies in their own worldviews. And I find these two guys just two of the most hopeful people I've ever met, because these are extreme levels of division that they're working with. And what they show, a bit like the parable of the Good Samaritan that we just heard, is that the power of encounter has this amazing ability to transform. Now, I don't want to kind of sugarcoat this because, of course, both Dave and Daryl are doing heavy emotional lifting in those conversations. There is real emotional labor involved for both of them in kind of empathizing and showing kind of that bridge-building willingness with people who are, oppressing them, who are saying things that are personally attacking them. And so, I'm not saying this is what all of us should be doing all of the time. In some ways, it's kind of easy for me, as like a straight white guy, to say, hey, we should all build bridges, because I'm often not at the sharp end of the kind of form of oppression that lots of people do face. But when we feel called to that, when we feel able to do that emotional work, the power of encounter and its ability to transform is just off the charts. And we can do some of this in smaller ways as well, that don't have to be quite as extreme as hanging out with members of the KKK. One of the programs we run at Larger Us is called Let's Talk Climate. And it's about helping ordinary people like us to just have really good, positive conversations about climate change with people we meet in our everyday lives. Because it turns out 55% of us rarely or never talk about climate, because we're worried about being preachy or self-righteous, or people calling us out as hypocrites. And the idea is if we can just break that silence and get more of us talking about climate change, it just opens up space for more ambitious action. And what we try and do in that training is borrow heavily from the inspirational work of people like Daryl and Dave, and train people to listen first, to resist the urge to kind of call people out or tell them why they're wrong, but kind of show respect, listen, and then respond kind of from the heart with our personal stories. And we find over and over again that that has the power to connect with people. So, those are two things that I think we can do in our relationships and in our community. We can just build connection by creating cultures of welcome and realizing that has so much power to improve not just like how we feel, our mental health and so on, but really make our democracy stronger in the process. But then also bridging divides with those curious conversations. And that when we can kind of stay connected, listen, and then gently speak from the heart about how we experience issues of kind of oppression or injustice or apocalypse, it has this amazing power to transform. And that's why the parable that we heard this morning is one of my absolute favourites. Next week, we will be talking about the world level and really big, deep stories, but that's enough for now.